We are beginning a new series to consider how old the Earth is and what that means for us as far as looking at evolutionary histories on the planet and the association of different organisms, including animals, to that change in the environmental composition of the Earth and the structures of the Earth that would impact their adaptations and their ability to survive in those environments. When we look at evolutionary history, we consider fossil records, of course, and we'll look at some of that, but we also need to consider the fact that when we look at these evolutionary histories, we are not only considering the organisms, living organisms that are present, but we also have to consider the abiotic factors or the non-living components. So with early atmosphere, we know that the early atmosphere on Earth was not a very pleasant place to be. It was full of things like methane, and hydrogen sulfide. Any water that was present on the planet was in the form of water vapor. There simply was too much heat to keep the water in its liquid form. But as the Earth cooled, we do get water vapor condensing and forming oceans. We are not looking at the production of water vapor into water as being the starting point for all life. Instead, what we want to think about is the other things that would have to be involved to get life started on this planet. We know that the Earth was also a very violent place early on, so high volcanic activity and lightning storms. UV radiation would have been very, very high, and we'll have to talk about how to get rid of that UV, because we're going to have to lower UV if you want anything to live on the surface of this planet. So an artist's rendition of kind of the starting cooling process on the planet, forming oceans and ponds and seas and so on. But what we want to focus on are the layers that end up forming in these rocks. They'll be important for us not only for finding fossils, but also for understanding the environmental composition at the time those fossils were deposited. So things like whether or not there was oxygen, sulfur compositions, nitrogen compositions, carbon compositions, and so on. We think that life ended up on this planet because of a couple of different ideas that surround the production of life, but also looking at the fact that you have to produce a habitable environment. So we think that life probably evolved on this planet in 4 major stages. We would have started out with those abiotic components that we mentioned, and they would have had to synthesize. So we can start out with things like nitrogen and carbon and sulfur and phosphorus available, but they have to actually synthesize and become small molecules for us to actually really get a sense of the beginnings of life. So forming things like amino acids, which would eventually form proteins, and looking at nitrogenous bases eventually forming DNA and RNA and so on. We also have to think about putting these together then into those polymers, so into proteins, into DNA, into RNA, and then eventually putting those together into something we call a protocell. So this is not a cell as you think of it today with organelles, but instead really kind of an oily surface to separate those forming polymers from the rest of the environment, which would tend to chew them up. And eventually we have to get to the point of self-replicating molecules, and we think that the first one was probably RNA. We don't lean towards DNA because DNA is not self-replicating, but RNA will self-replicate. On kind of a grand scheme of things, we think the Earth sits at about 4.6 billion years old at this point, as far as our dating records can take us. But the Earth was barren essentially for the first billion years because we're looking at the cooling and the settling of this planet and trying to form organisms from essentially the elements available in the atmosphere, right? So we don't see the formation of large organisms and complex organisms until much later because frankly there's no oxygen. So organisms as we know it did not start to form until much later. Now we still have some prokaryotes that would be oxygen-hating molecules, so we call these anaerobic. Okay, but most of what we know today and what is present today on our planet is oxygen-loving. So when we look at the progression, this shouldn't surprise you that we go into single-celled eukaryotes, multi-celled eukaryotes, and then finally this would have all been in the oceans, we think, and then eventually colonizing land only about 500 million years before today. Scientists spend a lot of time looking at rock strata, we've mentioned that before, and looking at how these fossils are deposited. But now, instead of just looking at the animals and organisms, let's think about the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the sulfur and the potassium that would have also been around, and helps us to understand what that environment would have been like for these organisms to live in. We actually look at kind of calculating age and life on this planet through a number of different scenarios, but the big one that we look at or try to think about is this division that typically occurs because of extinction events. Why do you think we would focus on extinction events? What are they going to produce for us that we would be able to study today? The Permian extinction is one we'll mention a lot. It actually wiped out 96% of the species that we think were present on the planet at that time. That's a big extinction event, right? The Cretaceous extinction is one that you may be familiar with because this is the one where we lost all of the dinosaurs and allowed mammals and flowering plants to actually go through an adaptive radiation event that spread them across the entire planet then. The Cambrian explosion is actually a very interesting point in time, because when we talk about explosions, we're actually talking about diversification and adaptation events, and over time we typically only see these events occur after a great extinction. But this one is interesting in that it does not occur after a great extinction, but instead there must have been something going on that allowed this terrific explosion of organisms. And we think it was probably kind of the Earth settling, and the Earth was now more of a perfect place for organisms to really thrive. Over time, though, we look at things as being very, very, very slow. Everything you know today only happened in about the last 14% of evolutionary history.